there was a debate that I read about recently, and it was between sheep and grain. And when I say that, I do mean between the animal and the food, the plant that grows in the ground. It's a really interesting and funny debate. And while it sounds weird on the surface level, it is important to what I want to bring to you about a lot of the ideas and concepts that I've been talking about: serialization, about comic books, about artwork, and about the value of such things, because I believe that there is no value to artwork if there is no discourse about that work. So you could have one of the greatest art pieces ever to be created with so much idea behind it and so much thought behind it. You could die, it gets locked up in an attic, and it is never seen. It's burnt down in a house fire, and nobody ever finds it. Nobody ever gets to talk about it. Nobody ever knows the person who did it, the artist in question. And so you have this debate. And this debate was written down in stone on a cuneiform tablet thousands of years ago from Mesopotamia, Babylon, that area of the world. And I'm reading about these people and these places and what they do. And I come across this and I think, oh, that, I like that. So I look into it. Apparently there is a website called babylonarchives.com or something that transcribes all cuneiform tablets that we have available that have been translated into English. And better yet, on the internet, that you could look them up by name and read them through and through. You could probably print them out too. I mean, nobody copyrighted thousands of year old cuneiform tablets. So I read it. And I was thoroughly entertained. And apparently that's the point. The point was they would have these debates. They would have between summer and winter. They would have silver and copper. And sheep and grain was one of many debates that they would have, that they would put on theatrical performances of. So these people thousands and thousands of years ago that lived in these societies, the Near East societies, the foundation of our society now, the first people who invented writing, the first people to invent writing invented debates between sheep and grain. I think that's really fascinating. You invent this revolutionary form of communication, and the first thing you do is, what if the sheep got into a fight with the grain and they had it out over a drunken fever and the gods decided who won? Now, if I had invented writing, I mean, I'm sure that's the first thing I would have done. And they use these to entertain people. And I'm bringing that to you because I want to give you guys a little bit of context to the situation here, that people thousands of years ago, 2,000, 3,000 years before Christ, were putting on stage performances, going out to be entertained the same as you and I. What I always learn when I'm looking at history, when I'm reading these books and looking at people thousands of years ago, I like, hey, wait a minute, these guys are pretty similar to us. You look at the Romans, they had staged naval conflicts in the Colosseums. They would flood the Colosseums, put boats in there, have faux naval battles in there as forms of entertainment. The gladiators were gladiators the same way that UFC fighters and boxers are now, just combat sports athletes. And you keep on looking at these guys, and you look at the way that they entertain themselves, you look at the way that they go to shows and stage performances, and you realize, hey, you know, they're not so different from what we are now. As much as we like to say we're so much better, and I would say to that we're not a whole lot smarter than they are, we just know more. And that's the only real difference. But if they knew as much as we did, they probably wouldn't be all that different, considering how much they did with the little that they had. Now, to break it down for you, and to spoil the debate, the 1,000-year-old debate for you guys, grain won. Grain bested sheep. Grain that has no brain or thought process was able to pull one over on the sheep, and the gods Enki and Enlil, I believe, said, oh, you know what? Grain took this one. And if you want to know how grain won, it boiled down to, well, the sheep said, I clothe the gods. The grain said, I feed the gods. The grain said, shepherds are shown away from grain fields because the sheep interfere with the crops. And ultimately, grain won because grain said, you sheep need to eat me, but I do not need to exist without you. Grain can exist independently of sheep. Sheep needs to feed on grain. So the gods said, grain wins, because sheep needs grain, grain doesn't need sheep. Now you might still think, okay, but what relevance does this have? What relevance did this have to the people back then? And I'll tell you, the relevance was both grazing sheep, cattle, herding sheep, that took land. That took large spaces of land. That took work. So did grain fields, right? So the debate was really over, should the shepherds get the land or should the farmers get the land? Ultimately, the farmers got the land. Now, if you're still wondering, okay, why am I listening to this guy talk about a thousands-year-old debate that I've never heard about? That's exactly why. Because this debate that was very relevant to the people then, that people went to stage performances of these debates where actors would really try to sell you on them. And I mean, they all knew the ending, the gods determined it, but they would go to stage plays the same way people watch Shakespeare plays, the same way people go to Broadway, the same way we go to the movies right now. And I bring that to you because that's some of the first instances of culturally relevant entertainment that we have on record. I mean, heck, it's written in stone. How much older can you get than that? And there's this UFC fighter that I follow a lot, and I take a lot of notes from him. He had this really funny quote, Chael Sonnen, and he said, before words existed, there were stories. And that's one of the funniest things that I've ever heard. And at first you think, well, it's a real bizarre thing to hear, but he's right. Before words existed, there were stories, and of the human condition, storytelling seems to be one of the fundamental parts of our being. That from conception, we were telling stories about gods and heroes doing great things that inspired us to do things within our day-to-day lives. And I bring that to you because what are superheroes, I believe it's Neil Gaiman or Alan Moore who said it, than the modern-day myths, the modern-day gods. The only difference between superheroes and the gods is we don't believe that the superheroes exist. We know Batman's not real. We know Superman's not real. The Bat Otter is very real. I'm standing right in front of you. But on that note, they believed in their gods. And they believed that they were there. And that's really the only cultural significantly difference, which, by the way, is a significant difference. Believing something is real and not, big difference. So how does that apply to the comic book landscape today? That I am telling you about a debate between sheep and grain thousands of years ago that was culturally relevant to them at that point in time, to the people listening to these stories. I say that because there are stories coming out right now that you know as little of as you know of the debate between sheep and grain. And these are stories that are said to be successful by successful writers who are in fact successful. I always bring it back to that there is no real definition of success in today's landscape of comic books. You could say that a debate between sheep and grain would not succeed in today's market. I would bring to you that the successes of today's market are in themselves not successful in today's market. And why is that? Well, it's the same reason that the debate between sheep and grain wouldn't be successful, and that is nobody would talk about it. There is no discourse about it. There is no value within the art form because there is no discourse on the topic. There's no discourse on the work. It could be misinterpreted discourse, but discourse nonetheless is what keeps art and the human being alive, because without it, without the retelling of the story, there's nothing to it. And I think I can bring you this story. I can bring you these debates. Sheep and grain, silver and copper, right? I could bring that, and you could hear them and you might forget about them tomorrow, which is regardless of the point. But I could bring that to you in just the same way that you can go to your comic book store, which I'm sure very little of you do, look at a book on the shelf, not even think twice about it. And if that's how most people are viewing these comic books, which most people are, because they don't read them, I can't find a whole lot of discourse on the independent comic book scene going on right now in the mainstream industry, though I can find decent levels, albeit small, but levels of discourse about the smaller independent scene. Your boy Zach, Young Rippa, Ethan Van Sciver, Dan Fan, Narwhal. I can find discourse on those guys. I can find a consistent base of people that are discussing their work and their ideas more so than I can find in the mainstream industry. And I find that very fascinating because I've been talking about since day one what makes independent comics successful, what makes a successful comic book in this day and age, and I'm still trying to come to an answer. My answer to successful art, to meaningful art, is discourse on the topic. So if we applied my definition of that to the mainstream independent comic book scene, of which there is little discourse, I would say that the smaller scene that's making less money supposedly, that's selling less allegedly, is more successful, artistically speaking, than mainstream comic books. Which is really weird because you think, well, how is the smaller one more successful than the bigger one if the bigger one makes more money? Does it? That's the real question. Does it make more money? I don't know. We don't know because they don't tell us. I can tell you the statistics of the indie scene right now. We can look them up with a quick Google search. You cannot do that with the mainstream industry. So the level 2 success, the meaning of success, at least in terms of art, well, that's going to the independent scene all the way. They may not be getting their books out on time. They might not be having the best material in the world. They may not even have better material than the mainstream industry. Yet, artistically speaking, of which comic book artists, comic book writers, the surname to that is artist, is writer, well, that goes to the indie scene. And I find that really weird because you would think there's less people there, yet there are more people consistently there than in the mainstream. And I find the debate between sheep and grain very relevant to that, because nobody's talking about the debate between sheep and grain as little as they're talking about the mainstream comic books, at least from what I've seen.